Hello and welcome to yet another video, and in this video I'll be talking about this lens right here. It's the original Canon EF 24-70mm f2.8L lens. Now this lens has been out for a little while now, I know, but it's also been long discontinued by Canon as well because of their replacements, the Mark II version. But this lens is still a great lens and I have been using it for the past 10 or 11 years or so. This was actually my first L lens that I ever bought for both my professional and personal work as well, whether it's for video and photography work as well. So in this video I would like to actually share with you some of my thoughts about this lens in case you're actually considering about getting this lens or just want to have some sort of second or third opinion on this lens. So without further ado, let's get into the video. So in this video I'll be dividing into different sections, so the build quality, the usability, and into the image quality and conclusion. So let's first start with the actual build quality and usability. So the lens is really well built. This lens has survived so many kind of conditions. I've taken it to sports shoots, event shooting, through tropical weathers, through storms, and it really survived a lot. Actually, I once broke the metal mount, but the lens survived. It survived. It dropped from like around this high all the way to the concrete ground, and it really bended the mount here, and the motor was fine, everything was fine. They just needed to repair the actual mount, and that was it. The weather sealing still works perfectly fine. Oh, and this lens actually has a weather sealing, whether if you're zooming in or out like this, it's actually perfectly weather sealed. I have taken it through like rainstorms in tropical countries, and I even threw my camera gear from boat to boat when I was traveling through Thailand. So it has a really nice rugged build quality to this lens. But this lens is actually really heavy, and if you add on the hood, it's actually gonna be about this long, that big. So if you like using heavy and big gear, then you know this lens will definitely tick that box for you. But if you have a lot of gear, this lens might not be for you because it is heavy. But this lens does have that f2.8 constant aperture, so it might be also eliminating some of the lenses you might be bringing along the trip with you. Another positive point about this lens is also the zoom ring and also the focus ring itself. They're both really buttery smooth, and it's not really stiff at all. It's just, I think, a really nice amount of smoothness. Of course, that will vary on the mileage if you get this lens, or if you still have this lens, you know, how you've been using it. So some might already be a bit more stiff and some might be already a bit more loose. But usually it doesn't really degrade that much throughout the year. And the rubber on here is still really nice. So I would say the build quality and the quality of focusing and zooming is really nice. But if you're working with video, for example, the ring still can be a little bit smoother. I think the 24-105 or something like the 17-40mm lens will have a much smoother zoom ring if you really want to zoom when shooting video. For this, it's still a little bit too jitter or stiff for that. But you know, if you're taking pictures in like cold environment, it does give you that nice confirmation that you're actually zooming. So yeah, that's something. And also the focus ring, it feels like an infinity focus, but when you do reach the beginning or the very end, there is a subtle click to it that you don't really hear, but you do feel. So it's also a nice confirmation that way when you're actually manually focusing with this lens, which you have to sometimes because this lens is not really good at focusing in low light. What I experienced using this lens when focusing in low light, regardless of the camera I have, whether it's the 1DX, the EOS R, the older 5D Mark III, 5D Mark IV as well, is that like even an f4, like a modern f4 lens from Canon will be able to focus in low light better than the f2.8, the older f2.8 here from Canon. There's something about the lens that somehow confuses the camera a little bit in certain low light condition when it comes to focusing. So, you know, just take it for what it is. It is on the latest firmware, so there's that. Otherwise, I don't really have much to say about it, though it's kind of weird that, you know, to zoom to 24, it actually stands, and it's reverse zooming, like collapsing in for 70. So yeah, it's a little bit weird engineering sometimes because most lenses, when you go to wide, it collapses, and when you go to telephoto, it actually goes outwards. So yeah, there's that. Otherwise, another point to actually point out is actually nitpicking, but this switch right here, the autofocus and manual focus switching is a little bit stiff in my opinion, or at least maybe this is just on my particular copy, but I just wish it's more of like the 17 to 40 or the 16 to 35 millimeter lens, or even the 24 to 1:5 lens. Those are not as stiff, nowhere as stiff as this particular lens. But some of you might like that if you want to keep it all the time on manual focus or all the time on autofocus. It will definitely not be able to switch easily if it's thrown into your bag, so that's a good thing, but it's a little bit stiff. And on other lenses that I've just mentioned, they also don't get knocked to a different mode that easily. So yeah, but hey, it's already been discontinued, so I don't think Canon can do anything about that. And the newer 24-70 Mark II, the f2.81, is actually already better, an improvement. And the last point is actually a positive point in my opinion, because this lens has the 77mm filter thread here. This is actually a really common filter thread size, so you will be able to find filters and other accessories for the front of this lens rather easily. So having a lot of supply in that size means you will also find a lot of nice budget offers of accessories and filters for this size of diameter for your lens. The next point is actually the image quality. The image quality coming out of this lens will not really blow your mind away. It will get a lot of things done really nicely. It's not like specialized lens for anything, but it's like a jack of all trade, but master of all none pretty much. So the focal length is nice. It's from semi-wide to semi-telephoto, 24-70mm. And if you're mounting on a crop frame camera, it will give you a further reach as well. This lens, the glass itself is not the sharpest glass you'll ever see, but once you get it perfectly in focus, sometimes it can also surprise you. So it can be a little bit soft on the wider end and also on the mid-range end. And the sensor sharpness though does remain actually quite sharp consistently, but the corners is just a little bit soft with the wider and the more mid-range side of focal length. But stopping it down, you'll get a lot of things in focus. But as mentioned earlier, this lens do have a little bit of a hard time sometimes with autofocusing system. Sometimes it can confirm that it is in focus, and to a naked eye on the back of the screen, it does look in focus, but if you bring it up to post later, it can be a tad out of focus, like a hair out of focus, which that it could be more in focus. So it's a very typical problem with this lens actually. So if you're planning to print big or just view it on your big monitor, you might have to refocus several times just to get that confirmation that it's actually in focus, because sometimes it's almost so in focus that you think it's in focus just based on judging on the back of the display or in the viewfinder or what have you, depending on the camera you are using. So yeah, just take that as a grain of salt. The barrel distortion on this lens and also the cushion effect, the pincushion effect on this lens is also controllable. You can definitely fix it easily in post nowadays. And if you're just shooting JPEG with the correction enabled in the camera, then it's also fine. Even with the correction enabled, it's not going to give you such a soft image. It will be a nice image at the end of the day, because you're really it's not that much that the image will be stretched or anything, so you will still get a really nice and detailed image at the end of the day. Another nice thing about the image quality coming out of this lens is also the contrast control. Now the contrast coming out of this lens is actually nice if you're not shooting directly into sunlight. The moment you start to introduce direct source of light into the image or shooting into almost direct to direct sunlight, it will actually decrease the contrast of the image quite dramatically. And when the contrast of the image decreases, some reason the autofocusing system also isn't as reliable anymore. So it is still reliable, just imagine if it was 95% reliable. If you point it directly into the light source, it actually decreases that to maybe around 85% reliability with the autofocusing system. But this also depends on the copy of the lens. It's not always consistent that way, so I'm just giving the percentage number just for you to kind of imagine. It's sometimes not as bad, but when it shows, it really shows. And now leading into the more negative things about this lens, the chromatic aberration, the color fringing on this lens is actually horrible for modern day standards. The bokeh is okay, but it's not the best that you'll see either. It will get the job done. If you're doing something like photojournalist, it's definitely okay. But if you're really focusing into portraits, even the 50mm f1.8 shooting at f2.8 will do a much better job than this lens. And it's also going to be sharper and has better contrast with the newer STM f2.8 50mm lens when compared to this. So if you're really shooting portraits, I really would avoid using this because the bokeh, the contrast control isn't really there. But for a basic journalist, for basic daily life shooting, for maybe like starting sort of like wildlife shooting, then, you know, all around kind of lens for starting, then I would say that this lens is pretty good. With the weather sealing, it's also nice. But at the end of the day, this lens will actually still give you a really nice image quality. You can shoot a lot of things. You can just do travel photography. If you just want one camera, one lens setup, then maybe this lens is also a nice lens for you, especially if you're on a budget. Because like this lens isn't really that expensive nowadays, and it's still giving you that constant f2.8 aperture. So even if you were to break it, lose it, it's not a lot to really replace it again, because, you know, there are plenty of these out there in the secondhand market for a really low price. Sometimes I see it going for like 300, 350 euros. So it's really that cheap now for such a quality lens. But of course, if you have a higher standards of comparing it to like even the more modern 16 to 35mm lens from Canon, or the second version of this lens, then, you know, this lens is not going to really stand a chance with those lenses, because the sharpness is not as sharp throughout the focal range. But is it sharp enough for you? I think if you're just starting out or you're really on a budget, it is really sharp enough for you. And if you're just starting out like shooting in studios or a more controlled environment, it's still a perfect lens to get, because especially in a controlled environment where you can control the lighting, control everything, then, you know, there's nothing really to really be worried about this lens at all. So now into my conclusion. So throughout the video, I've been saying that, you know, if you don't mind this, and if you don't mind that, and if you don't have such a high standards of modern lens, it is still a nice lens. And I do mean by that. So if you're like starting out in photography, especially on the Canon side of things, and if you're looking at like budget lenses, budget good lenses, then this is still one of them. You know, the mount is metal, the build quality is really nice. And, you know, there are still a lot of metal built within the construction of this lens. And this lens is built so solidly. And, you know, I've dropped this lens before and it survived, and it just proved to be such a tough lens. And for the price that you can get nowadays, I think that, you know, this lens is a no-brainer, because it's just still very sharp. It has that f2.8 constant aperture. The manual focus here is really nice. The autofocusing system is also not loud, and it's just still a professional, reliable lens to use. So just take it as one of those all-around first step to professional lens to get, and once you master everything, you know exactly what you want. It's kind of a lens then you just leave behind and then buy more specialized or more specific lens that you want to use, because this was my first L lens that I use, and then I just saved up for, you know, the 85 1.2 so that I can shoot events and portraits, things like that. And then I have my 50mm f1.8 at the time, and now I have the 1.4 and also the 35 1.4, because I know if I want to go wider or more standard focal length, I like those lenses more, and they're also sharper than this lens to a certain extent. So yeah, well, the 1.4 50mm is actually a bit softer than this lens, but the 1.8 version is actually sharper and has nicer contrast than this lens at 50mm, and even at f2.8 as well. But, you know, if you're shooting something like landscape a lot and also architecture and everything, then this lens is also still a nice lens. If you stop it down to like f9, f8, f11, f10, you know, you're gonna get a really nice, decent image out of this lens with still really nice contrast control. So if you're starting out with architecture photography, you know, you're not trying to get everything in and have distortion, but you also like to focus on the details, things like that. This is a nice all-around lens as well, and I couldn't recommend this lens enough. Unless you don't really need that f2.8 at all, so maybe the f4 24 to 105mm is a consideration. But, you know, having that f2.8 is always nice to shoot, especially in low light as well, you know, where you might need the lower aperture if you're working with a more limited camera that doesn't go or doesn't have that much higher ISO to begin with. So yeah, do I recommend it for the price? Yes. But if you're already a professional and you have like professional standards for modern day cameras, and if you're printing large, maybe not. Because especially if you're printing large, the flaw of this lens with the more modern high quality printers or higher resolution screen, you will see it really, really clearly, and it's gonna bug you a little bit. But if you're really starting out or you're just an amateur, then this lens is still a really good lens to have. Yeah, so yeah, that's it for this video. I don't really have a lot to say about this lens because it is still, at the end of the day, a very obvious lens and also a really, really reliable lens to actually consider. So yeah, if you need a free photography guidebook, the link is down in the description below, and it's absolutely for free. You just don't need to submit anything, no email submission, just click and download. It's on my website. And if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me or just leave a message down below as well, and I'll do my best to get to you with the best possible knowledge I have. So yeah, thank you very, very much for watching. Have fun shooting, stay safe, bye for now.